Even though there are an infinite number of Ricks across the multiverse, to say that they're all the same and equal is a totally Jerry move. Even if they're all probably obsessed with Szechuan sauce, some Ricks are just more Rickish than others. But who's the ricketiest Rick of them all? Who is the ultimate Rick? Our friends at Screen Rant already made their own list of the Mortiest Mortys in the multiverse, and as we all know, every Morty needs a Rick. So, here's our rankings of the Rickest Ricks of all time. And if you haven't checked out the Screen Rant video, hop on over as soon as you're done here. Some Rick had to be at the bottom, and it might as well be Doofus Rick. It's not that Doofus Rick is a bad guy, it's just that he's a bad Rick. But it's only because he's nice, emotionally intelligent, and generally supportive of people that he's mocked mercilessly by the other Ricks. But the real reason he's at the bottom of this list is because he gets along well with Jerry, which is about the most un-Rick thing a Rick can do. So, although Doofus Rick might be the best Rick to make ovenless brownies with, he's just not the type of Rick we've come to truly appreciate. Simple Rick is a rare Rick that's different from a lot of the other Ricks because he was truly happy. This was a Rick who was actually a loving father to Beth and focused his life on being there for her as her dad. His happiest memory is making a toy for her, which Beth loved ecstatically, forcing Simple Rick to cry tears of joy. It's a nice thought, but does that really sound like Rick? No wonder the other Ricks captured him, strapped him to a chair, and extracted that happy memory over and over again to make Simple Rick wafers. The Council of Ricks may veer closer to the classic prickly attitude we expect from Ricks, but something about these high-ranking bureaucrats just screams sellout. The best thing about Rick Sanchez is that he never lets anyone tell him what to do. He plays by his own rules. The Council of Ricks almost embodies that idea, but overall are just a whole bunch of massive hypocrites. They feared government control, so they created their own government to control the multiverse of Ricks out there, which is just the kind of sickening boneheadedness that smarter Ricks would see as stupid. Cop Rick should be put in a museum, not because he looks any different from any other Rick, but because he lives with a huge sense of honor and responsibility that is severely lacking from almost every other Rick out there. To make things even stranger, he's paired with Cop Morty, who is unlike most Mortys with his cynical, corrupt nature. But although we commend Cop Rick for ultimately killing his corrupt partner because he wouldn't join him, it's that sort of nobleness that places him near the very bottom of the Rick list. Out of all the key traits that define the best Ricks, an almost multiversal common trait is extreme intelligence. Even the least Rickest Ricks seem to have at least some level of high intellect. Well, mostly all of them, excluding Slow Rick, who is so dumb that he's called Tall Morty by Teacher Rick. The saddest thing is that Slow Rick doesn't even seem to know he's actually a Rick. He has trouble with big words and can't seem to graduate his Morty class no matter how many times he's forced to take it. It was an origin story that seemed almost too on the nose. As the slimy Nathan Fillion-sounding alien Cornelius Daniel tried to manipulate Rick into showing him the secrets of his portal gun, Daniel saw a glimpse of Rick's past. Just like any cheesy movie, Rick was once a loving father and husband, who after losing his wife and daughter in an explosion becomes the mean, cynical man we know today. Of course, it's revealed shortly after that this was all fabricated by our Rick, and we should have suspected as much. So it's obvious why past Rick is ranked so low on this list. Somewhere in the multiverse, there's a Morty Rick out there roaming the streets. He's only in the background of the Rick Shank Redemption, but even if his appearance is brief, it raises so many questions. The most important one is if this Morty Rick is a Rick, a Morty, or a combination of both. If this is Morty Rick, is he paired with a Rick Morty? Is this a Rick and a Morty sharing the same body? Why is nobody getting to the bottom of this? To help with a vampire problem at their school, Rick transfers his consciousness over to a cloned version of his younger self, and thus Tiny Rick was born. Tiny Rick! Tiny Rick is very similar to regular Rick, and in fact, they almost seem like the same person at the beginning, albeit with Tiny Rick more optimistic and cheerful than old Rick. Although he seems like a fun Rick, it's soon clear that the original Rick's mind is trapped inside of Tiny Rick, and it's up to Morty and Summer to save him. Sometimes we get a quick look at a Rick, and it tells us everything we need to know about the character. In an oddly specific copying of a real-life figure, Rick Rick was a presidential candidate in the Tales from the Citadel episode that closely resembled Jimmy McMillan, the politician who mostly everyone remembers as the rent is too damn high guy. Every Rick has got to make a living somehow, right? And in the infinite multiverse, it stands to reason that there's a version of Rick out there doing every job imaginable. But we can't imagine one more annoying than Insurance Rick. He's the person at the mall kiosk you try to avoid talking to as you make your way to the food court. But at least he's got us wondering what Morty Insurance actually is. Regional Manager Rick is a rare Rick that actually moved up in the Rick hierarchy. In his one appearance, he started as Supervisor Rick for the Simple Rick's wafer cookie factory. As a supervisor, he seemed to hate his fellow Rick employees as well as his job. Overall, Regional Manager Rick was the type of jerk you wouldn't want as a boss, and we didn't have much sympathy when Rick J22 offs him in his office. Maybe don't underestimate your Ricks next time, Regional Manager Rick. It's just a thought. Rick and Morty has taught us that if a Rick does something drastic, there's probably a multiverse version of him that did something similar. In Rick Potion number 9, Rick ruins his universe by accidentally unleashing a virus that turns everything into disgusting Cronenberg monsters. It's so bad that Rick and Morty have to find another universe to inhabit and leave theirs behind. But in a funny twist, the end of the episode reveals that a Cronenberg Rick and Morty arrive at the freshly Cronenberged world, having ruined their own reality by turning everyone into normal humans. This version of Rick might be one of the closest to the Rick we know, just with some extra grotesque disfigurations. Sometimes the search for truth and justice can lead down some dark paths. Just ask Investigator Rick, who played a small yet vital role in the Tales from the Citadel episode. Investigator Rick, clad in a classic investigator trench coat and hat, was the one who discovered information about evil Morty, and passed what he knew over to campaign manager Morty. Maybe Investigator Rick shouldn't have stuck his nose where it didn't belong, because it ultimately cost him his life. Out of all the Ricks on this list, the one we want to see more of is definitely Cowboy Rick. Can you imagine the adventures Rick and Morty could get up to in the Old West? He's so cool and interesting that even Morty is distracted from Rick's long explanation about the multiverse of different Rick and Mortys to marvel at the Cowboy versions of them. Cowboy Rick truly helped the audience understand that anything is possible in the multiverse. But the real question is Cowboy Rick the fastest gun in the West? Does he ride horses and herd cattle and rob moving trains? We may never know the answer. Rick D. Sanchez III is a mixture of Rick and Willy Wonka. He walks around in an extravagant purple and gold suit while wielding a proper gold cane. He is the owner of Simple Rick's wafers and proved himself to be just as cold and calculating as all the great Ricks in the multiverse, but just immensely more greedy and power-hungry. At first, it seems like Rick D. Sanchez III is a kind and benevolent figure, wanting what's best for all Ricks, only to quickly reveal he has no interest in the welfare of other Ricks. This is why you don't trust people with top hats and gold canes. 99% of the time, it only leads to chaos and destruction. We have to respect Rick J22 for attempting to break the oppressive hierarchy of Ricks in the Citadel. Rick J22 was a normal worker at Simple Rick's wafer cookie factory who was mad about his position in life. In his eyes, all Ricks possess extreme intelligence, so why is he just a factory worker? So, of course, he snaps and goes on a rampage, offing his boss and trapping himself in a room with Simple Rick. He's smart enough to realize that he was being tricked with a fake portal gun, but he makes the mistake of trusting Rick D. Sanchez III, who promises to promote him for his rebellious attitude, but ends up paying the ultimate price for it, basically becoming the new Simple Rick. We discovered in Tales from the Citadel that the real rulers of the Citadel are the business Ricks, who control every economic interest in the city, and thus basically own everything. These guys have a lot of classic Rick traits, but are a hodgepodge of greedy, selfish Ricks who've risen to power. They make a huge mistake in underestimating a Morty, a fact that gets most of them executed. If only these Ricks were more passionate about science rather than becoming filthy rich, they could have done something good in the world. But alas, that just wasn't the case. The ones who survived the execution quickly give up and bow down to evil Morty, which doesn't seem very Rick-like. Teacher Rick ranks so high on this list because he's in a position to teach Mortys the proper ways to be Mortys, which really all Ricks tend to do. But if you were expecting a teacher version of Rick to be the warm and compassionate type of teacher you see in inspirational movies, guess again. Because this is still Rick we're talking about. Sure, he seems to be a good teacher, helping the Mortys to graduate from the Morty Academy, but he also isn't afraid to remind them all about their past mistakes and failures with his cruel taunting. While taking a trip to an intergalactic day spa, Rick has all of his cognitive toxins removed from his body, but with a nasty side effect. Those qualities that Rick deemed negative morphed together and created a version of Rick that was all of Rick's worst aspects exemplified. This toxic Rick was aggressive, extremely egotistical, dishonest, and vengeful, with a healthy dose of alcoholism mixed in there. Depending on how you look at it, toxic Rick might be Rick at his absolute Rickest, which is a terrifying thought. The real kicker is that one of Toxic Rick's qualities was a passionate and protective love of Toxic Morty, which means a connection to family is a trait that Rick sees as a negative quality in himself. Replacement Rick proves what a fine line Ricks walk in their quest for scientific advancement. Replacement Rick comes from a universe that's 99% like Rick and Morty's original dimension. The only difference is that the Replacement Rick was able to make a cure and save everyone from becoming Cronenbergs forever. Something original Rick couldn't actually do. The only downside is that the replacement dimension was one where Replacement Rick made a small error in his ionic defibrillator, causing an explosion that killed him and Replacement Morty. It allowed the original Rick and Morty to swoop on in and take their spots in the replacement dimension without anyone noticing. So really, it's fair to say that Replacement Rick was the closest thing to our Rick we've seen yet, minus the whole death thing. When Rick was suspected of killing different Ricks across the multiverse, he was brought to the Council of Ricks for questioning. Rick admits that while he always seemed to have disagreements with the Council, he says they should also question the scientist formerly known as Rick, since he was also known to cause trouble. When the Council reveals that Tafkar is already dead, it shocks Rick in a way that we didn't expect. Were these two friends? They seemed to share at least a mutual respect for each other, as they both appeared to disagree with how the Council of Ricks ran things. Not much else is known about this Rick, except he's obviously a huge Prince fan. Or maybe Prince was a big scientist formerly known as Rick fan. On the surface, Evil Rick seems like just a cold-hearted jerk who'll stop at nothing to do what he wants. Wait, that sounds like most Ricks. Let's try again. The Evil Rick appears to be a Rick who wants to eliminate other Ricks and torture Mortys. Yeah, there we go. It's a dark, twisted version of the Rick we know, but with almost all of the same cunning and knowledge. It's not until the end of Close Rick Counters of the Rick kind that we find out this Rick isn't the mastermind pulling the strings, but is being controlled by Evil Morty, whose goal was to create hatred toward all Ricks. Everything we heard Evil Rick say really just came from Evil Morty's mouth, so who knows what Evil Rick actually believed. This is the OG Rick, the Rick that we compare all of the Ricks to. Every different version of Rick that we see, we judge based off of what we know about Rick C-137. We know Rick is a mad scientist with severe alcoholism, nihilistic tendencies, and a god complex. But really, can you blame him for any of that after everything he's seen and done throughout the show? If there was a battle of Ricks where every single Rick in the multiverse were placed in a fight to the death, we're almost positive that Rick C-137 would come out on top. It's only because the two remaining Ricks on this list are different versions of this Rick that Rick C-137 doesn't take the top spot. The reason the iconic Pickle Rick places so high on this list is because it's not only hilarious seeing Rick turn himself into a pickle to avoid going to family therapy, but Pickle Rick represents Rick at his best, mainly meaning Rick trapped in an impossible situation and forced to quickly use his genius intellect to find a way out. Although you would think a pickle wouldn't be able to do much, in a glorious action-packed episode that would make Michael Bay jealous, Pickle Rick fights through cockroaches, rats, armed guards, and a deadly prisoner named Jaguar to win his freedom in spectacularly violent and bloody fashion. Pickle Rick is the action hero we need in our lives, and he's one of the best Ricks around. The deadliest and most dangerous of all the Ricks in the universe is Drunk Rick. We all know Rick has a bit of a drinking problem, but when he gets seriously blackout drunk, that's when he's near unstoppable. This was shown in Investigator 3, The Return of World Ender, when a drunk Rick goes full supervillain mode and creates a series of deadly traps while also defeating one of the most feared villains in the galaxy all in one drunken night. The real kicker is that he doesn't even remember doing it. Someone with this much intelligence and capacity for evil should never be allowed near booze. The next time it happens, who knows what the consequences could be. But before you go, we'd like to remind you that our good friends over at Screen Rant already made their own list of the Mortiest Mortys in the multiverse, so you can head on over there for even more of your favorite duo, Rick and Morty. We promise you won't regret it. And that's our list of the Rickest Ricks in Rick and Morty. If you liked our list, show us some love by liking this video. What's your favorite version of Rick? Let us know in the comments down below, and be sure to subscribe to CBR for more awesome cartoon content.